Hello, everybody, and welcome to Dot to Dot. Today, we're going to look at who is responsible for the mystery on Oak Island. We're going to try and connect a couple of theories. First theory is the Xena Halpern theory with the adventures of Ralph Sudeley. And then we're going to talk about the possibilities of Henry Sinclair and his connection and his lineage on how this may have happened on Oak Island. I'm under the persuasion that this is a multi-generational event, that the occupation of Oak Island was over a series of at least three occupations over a period of probably about 300 years. The evidence on Oak Island that we've seen through the Curse of Oak Island show seems to indicate that. So we're going to look at some of this stuff, and I have a little presentation, and we'll pull up the slideshow. So the Xena Halpern theory, for the most part, starts out with the Cremona documents, which was acquired by Bill Jackson in the 1970s. And her theory, and in her book, she talks about a document called A Year We Remember, which is basically the lost journal of Ralph Sudeley, which describes him going across the ocean in 1178 with the help of King Valdemar I of Denmark. And he finds this settlement of ancient Welshmen, which is in Hunter Mountain, New York. And he gets his hands on some documents from the first century that talks about going this treasure or religious artifacts that are in Jerusalem and in Jordan near Petra. And so he goes back after this journey to look for these. So one of the things that we're going to also talk about is the Rochefoucauld. Why is Francois Rochefoucauld mentioned up here? Now, I've had many questions about this map and that it's fake and everything like that. We're not going to really get into that. But why is Francois Rochefoucauld mentioned here? Now, Francois Rochefoucauld, the name Francois in the Rochefoucauld family, did not occur until after 1530. So this has to be information that was given after 1530. We're also going to talk about the 1347 number a little bit that was also discovered by Gretchen Cornwall and was on the Curse of Oak Island show this last season in Royston Cave. We're going to talk about Royston Cave. And we're also going to talk about the Lion Cub of Talmont. And we're going to basically focus on the area or the castle at Talmont. So one of the things about medieval Europe is that the feudal system is very much the means in which at least nobles and probably commoners too, connected to those nobles, made their living. Everything in your possession, every power, all your means of making a living and what you did was based upon your lineage. So if we're going to go to Oak Island, or for the most part, we're going to go from Jerusalem to England to Oak Island, you're going to need the means and the credentials in order to secure that kind of a transport. So here's the lineage of Ralph de Sudeley. And did he have the ability to go to Valdemar, King of Denmark? I mean, I can't make an appointment with President Biden to say, yeah, I want to talk to you. You have to have credentials. So this is something that is very important to this theory. Did Ralph de Sudeley have the credentials or the ability to go to Valdemar first? And I did a study on his lineage. Now, there's a lot of people. One thing about history, there's always going to be somebody who's going to be a critical or a skeptic about any kind of research. And I'm no historian, so I know that there may be some out there that would pretty much tear this apart, but a lot of this research is coming from historians and from people that have done extensive research on the lineage of Ralph de Sudeley. So Ralph de Sudeley is a very interesting character. He has both lineage from the Norman Rollo, but also he has lineage from the House of Wessex. Now, King Athelred of England was out of the House of Wessex, and he married Emma of Normandy. And this is where the connection of both Normans and the House of Wessex. Now, the House of Wessex comes from Denmark, and the House of Wessex was, it basically ran until basically King Edward the First. He was the last of the House of Wessex, and then the House of Normandy pretty much took over. But Ralph de Sudeley had the lineage from both of these. So he was a rich person. He was not as rich as probably his great-grandfather, Ralph the Timid of Sudeley, but he definitely had clout and most likely the means. So you can read these, pause it and read some of these. One of the things that we're also going to talk about is the Treaty of St. Clair. And the Treaty of St. Clair was a foundational document that established Rollo as the Duke of Normandy when he married Papa of Bayeux, which was a French princess at the time. So this St. Clair, we're going to see, is pretty much connected to the St. Clairs and the De Clairs of England and Scotland. So this is the lineage of Ralph de Sudeley. His connection with Valdemar the First would be that he is descended from Emma of Normandy, who actually, her second husband was actually the King of Denmark, the King of Norway, and the King of England. So this lineage here, or this man, Canute the Great, had a lot of access not only to his power of these three regions, but also as the King of Norway, he had to have had some information about possibly the voyages that the Norwegians made to North America. Now, I know in some of the theories that they say the Xena brothers were the ones that basically gave the instructions or had the ability to go to North America through Henry Sinclair. But I believe that it was an inherent knowledge within not only the Scottish, but within the Normans through their link with the Norwegians and Denmark and the peoples right here that were basically Vikings, descendants of Vikings or parts of the Viking group that came out of Scandinavia and Denmark. So Ralph de Sudeley, as soon as he came back from the supposed voyage to North America, he joined the Knights Templar and went to the Holy Land in 1182. And he was a leader of some Templars, and they apparently found some relics. They found the relics at the Temple Mount and also at a place called Jebel Madaba in ancient Petra. Now, this is disputed. All this is pretty much a theory, and it is not any kind of historical facts or evidence to support this. In 1189, he returned home to, Herdewicke. And on his arrival, now this is important, on his arrival, de Sudeley immediately bought some land and founded a Templar preceptory or a training camp for new recruits for a fresh new crusade planned by the English King Richard. Now, King Richard he wasn't pure Norman. He had some House of Wessex in him. Actually, the last king that was in the pure Norman line was Henry I, which would be his grandfather. But King Richard, immediately upon his crowning, went on a crusade. Now, he died in 1192, but between the time he was crowned and the time that he died, he was pretty much on crusade, which he got the title Richard the Lionhearted and also the Crusader King. So in 1182, Richard I, he was also the Lord of Talmont. Now, remember, I showed that Talmont, the lion cub of Talmont, on Xena Halpern's map. So he was the Lord of Talmont. And Talmont is a castle, an area and a castle on the west coast of France near the region of Poitou. And he was at this castle, and it remained in his possession until he died. And he went there a lot. He probably spent many of his early years before the Crusades at that castle. He was crowned king in 1189. And one of the important things, too, is he frees King William of Scotland, who was basically under obligation to England from his father, Henry II. And he frees him basically to raise money for his crusade. So he starts off on his crusade in 1190. And here's the important things. These are important. He doesn't go straight to Jerusalem or Accra. Now, Jerusalem and Accra fell to the Muslims in 1187. This is one of the reasons he goes on to the crusade, is because of the fall. But it may be also that when Ralph de Sudeley came home, he may have told King Richard of what he found. Now, did Ralph de Sudeley bring all this back to England at the time he found it? I don't think so. I don't think he would have had the means or the kind of support to bring it home. Remember, most of the Middle East at that time was swarming with Muslims. And so they weren't Muslims at the time. They were people of Syria and Middle East people. So I guess they were Muslims. So sorry. All right. So the King Richard, he goes to Sicily, and he basically stabilizes the island of Sicily where his sister was residing. Her husband had just passed away, so he had to get her inheritance back and get some control there. And then he arrived on Cyprus, which had been basically taken over and needed to be cleaned out. And an important person who gets involved in this is Guy of Lusignan. Now, Guy of Lusignan he's been down in the Middle East and crusading for quite a while, but he helps Richard to take back Cyprus. And then after they took Cyprus, the Knights Templar were awarded the island. He actually was sold. He sold the island to the Knights Templar. And then shortly after that, it was under the control of Guy Lusignan. Shortly when they took over after they took over Cyprus, they went and retook the fortress of Accra. And then after they did that, Richard started coming home. He got shipwrecked, or basically got blown off course into the Greek island of Corfu. He's taken hostage, and he doesn't arrive back home until 1194. And then 5 years later, Richard is hit by a crossbow when he's trying to claim some alleged Roman treasure found in Limousin, France, and he dies of gangrene. But what I take from this is it possible that Ralph de Sudeley told Richard about the treasure? He then, Ralph de Sudeley assembled a training of some Templars in order to assist to get what he found out of Jerusalem or out of the area of Jerusalem and start to bring it home. And that King Richard had to basically clear the way for this transport. He had to take over Accra. He had to take over Cyprus and Sicily. All these islands are necessary to bring home whatever they had. Is it possible? Well, anything's possible, I guess, in history. Now, we're also going to talk about the Royston Cave. And the Royston Cave was presented by Gretchen Cornwall on the Curse of Oak Island this season. And it depicts a bunch of carvings that J. Beldam, I believe in the 1800s, basically did a study of this, saying that it is the royalty of the Normans, and it is basically showing the history of the Norman dynasty. And here we have, some saints that are here. Down here, this is supposedly King Richard I and his supposed wife that he really never really married. And these are, he says these are people that are associated with the family who had control of that area where the Royston Cave is. And there's King Henry II. This is supposedly John the Baptist. This is Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was very instrumental. I believe this over here is Rollo, his wife, and William the Longsword, and this is the longsword. Then we have William I of Scotland, and I don't know who this is, but it could be somebody associated with Rollo, and then we don't know who this is. But these are all pictures, according to Beldam, are pictures of the royalty and the dynasty of the Normans. Now, who had control over this Royston Cave? Well, according to Beldam, it was these two women here, Roissy de Clare, Roissy de Vere. Now, notice it's de Clare, of Clare. Now, this comes into play when we talk about the St. Clairs, because it's interesting how this name comes about. And they're descended from Walter Gifford, who was also an important baron of William the Conqueror. And here it goes down. And the main person that we're going to look at here is William de Mandeville. And his descendancy comes through here. Another person that is very much of a royal is Richard de Clare. And Richard de Clare is basically can go back all the way to Rollo. So he is a de Clare, and that has to do with he's a descendant of Rollo. Also worthy to note that the de Clare coat of arms is pretty much similar to the Rochefoucauld. So this is de Clare, okay? His descendants is Geoffrey of Brion, and his lineage goes back to Richard I of Normandy. However, he's not legitimate. He was basically, a bastard child. He was illegitimate for any kind of royal line. But if you go through this, you can see the credentials down to, and this is the Richard de Clare, Richard Fitzgilbert. That's how they name him. He's the son of Gilbert, and he was styled. It says down here he was styled de Clare. So in other words, this de Clare of Clare is basically an endorsement of your name, that you have lineage back to Rollo and the conquest or the award that he got for the Duke of Normandy. So William de Mandeville, one of the things that's notable about him is that he associated himself with the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers. Now remember, William de Mandeville is during the time of Ralph de Sudeley and also Richard I. He died the same year as, or 10 years before Richard I. So he was definitely in charge of this area of Royston Cave. And after he died, this man jumps in, and he is Geoffrey Fitzpeter, and he basically takes the role of the nobleman who takes care of the land that Royston Cave is on. Now, both Mandeville and Geoffrey Fitzpeter were both chief justiciars of England, which means that they were pretty much like the prime minister of England. So they were important people, and they were connected to the Royston Cave. Now, King Henry III, he was the son of King John, who was the king after King Richard I. And this is when one of the things that was happening in England at the time, and in France, especially in France, is the Norman nobles were becoming less and less popular. Their lands they were fighting between one another, and their whole dynasty, the Norman dynasty, was deteriorating. And during Henry III's rule, the Louisnans, notice the Louisnans were very prominent in England, and Henry was pretty much favoring them because he was, in fact, still a Norman, and he was getting some blowback from his barons, and his barons expelled the Louisnans from England. So you can start to see the story forming of where the Normans are being pretty much persecuted and fighting amongst each other about securing their feudal rights to their lands and their titles. So, one of the things that is in Royston Cave that is notable is the 1347, which is on the Xena Halpern map. However, on the Xena Halpern map, we believe that it is indicating a distance, but it doesn't mean that it can't also be came to be about by a number of 1347. And one of the notable things about 1347, the year, it wasn't necessarily the plague, because the plague didn't hit England until the next year. But in France, King Edward besieged Calais. And that is a town that is right on the English Channel in France. And this became an important strategic asset for the English. So in other words, the English were starting to move into France and basically, in a way, just take away the Norman power in Western and especially in the northwestern part of France. Because here we have a date also in the Royston Cave, 1359. Now, they say it may be 1350, but if it is 1359, it relates to the year of the treaty where the lands between the Loire River and the English Channel, all of basically Brittany and northwestern France, was given over to France. So or given over to England. And this really incited a lot of the barons because King John II was king at that time. He had been taken prisoner during the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But King John signed this over to the English, and it really started a lot of contention between barons, and things were just a mess. So let's talk about Sinclair and where that name came from. The name derives from a hermit, and this is, I don't know how true this is, Sinclair, at this place called Sinclair-sur-Epte. And it's a town near Paris. And this guy was martyred, and it's a long story, but he was martyred in the year 1884. So this is a place, Sinclair-sur-Epte, and it's the location where Rollo was given the title of the Duke of Normandy. Now, it's interesting because I'm finding that the people that are associated with the name Sinclair, just like we saw before in Richard de Clare, that they took different forms of the name depending on their family. It could either be de Clare or de Saint Clair or just Saint Clair. So in the lineage of Henry Sinclair, William, he's the first of the lineage of the Sinclair family, other than Rollo, and he was basically a cousin to the Richard William the Conqueror, who was also a descendant of Rollo. And it's recorded that in the Domesday Book, which is a big historical piece of information, that there were several St. Clair knights that were companions of William of Hastings. So this is basically this St. Clair name. Instead of saying William Fitzpatrick, they took the name of like St. Clair or de Clare in order to show their feudal lines back to basically Rollo of Normandy. So if we look at William St. Clair, now this is later down the line. He's the 6th Baron of Roslin, and I believe he was the first Baron to be associated with Roslin. We see that William St. Clair was a member of the Scottish Embassy, but he was involved with this bringing of Yolande, this French Duchess of Dreux, Yolande of Dreux, the daughter of Robert, the Count of Dreux, to England, to Scotland, to be the queen to Alexander III of Scotland. And he is around the same time that he did this, he also acquired some Templar lands. So we're going to find that the Sinclairs, even though there's no, they don't say it in their website, they were associated with the Knights Templar. So Yolande and Margaret. Margaret was the Maid of Norway, and Yolande was taken to Scotland to marry Alexander. She got pregnant. Unfortunately, the baby was didn't survive, and then that was going to be the heir to Scotland. And since she could not produce an heir, Margaret of Norway basically became king because Alexander III died falling from his horse prior to the birth of this baby. So here's another link to the Scottish with Norway and Eric II of Norway. This is his child. So here is a big big connection to Norway and the Scots. And Arthur II, this Yolanda eventually becomes the Duchess of Brittany, which is the area up in north western France, which was being taken away in that, remember that 1359 treaty. So in just after this, when Margaret, the Maid of Norway, died, the Scots and the French created the Old Alliance, and this was the alliance between Scotland and France, and it still pretty much goes till this day, I think. It's one of the oldest alliances between Scotland and France, and they did this to protect themselves from England later on when King Edward comes to power. Okay, so we're going to talk about the connections between some of the Louis Nans, and also we're going to find that the House of Drew comes into play, and also we're going to see some connection later about the Rochefoucalds. Now, the House of Thors is a old house in Western France, and it goes way before Amory IV, who was a companion of William the Conqueror. But I wanted to show you that this person who we're going to get down to, who was Louis I, the last male of the House of Thors, look at his credentials. His lineage is just rife with all kinds of connections. We have connections with the Louis Nans. We have connections with Robert II, the Count of Drew, which actually Louis I becomes the Count of Drew. And also he has lineage going back to the Norman William the Conqueror. So Louis I, let's see, Louis I was the Viscount of Thors, but he was also the Count of Drew from his marriage, from his marriage of Joan of Drew. But he was also the Lord of Talmont, and he lived at Talmont Castle. So it's very interesting that he is possibly the lion cub of Talmont. Now, this was brought forth by Gretchen Cornwall, I think a couple of years back. She's the one that actually brought this character forward as possibly the lion cub of Talmont. So Louis I was also at the Battle of Poitiers, but notice that he was a bannerman from 1338 till 1341, and then the next time we hear of him is not until 1356 at the Battle of Poitiers. So did he possibly travel to Oak Island between 1341 and 1356? I don't know that much history of Louis I. There's not that much available, but there could be a possibility. Now, Louis I, he died at Talmont Castle in 1370, and his only child who survives was Peronelle, and she married this man right here, Amory IV of De Craon. And this man right here is very interesting because he's of the same family that Guy VIII de Rochefoucauld, he marries into the same family as the Louis I's daughter. Now, he was a captain of the French in 1347, but then he switched to the English by persuasion of the Norman nobles, and he died in 1373. So Guy VII de Rochefoucauld, he was a baron, and he was killed next to the King John II in the Battle of Poitiers. So Louis I, he was he was a bannerman first, and then he fought on the side of John II at the Battle of Poitiers. So Louis I and Guy VII both knew each other, most definitely knew each other, because they both fought at the Battle of Poitiers. And then Guy VII's son marries into the same family as Louis I's daughter was in, and she was the last of the line of Louis I and the House of Thors that would basically that would be in charge of Talmont and Talmont Castle. So the St. Clair line, it goes from the 7th Baron of Roslin. So we had the 6th, now 7th. And then Henry St. Clair, he is I would say the 8th or the 9th Baron of Roslin. But he is the person who all the stories about him coming to North America and possibly bringing the treasure that's supposedly on Oak Island, or whatever it is, relics or treasure of Oak Island, to North America. So the English, the House of Druze, the French House of Druze, they had a tie with Henry Sinclair, or Scotland. The Sinclairs were definitely Norman, and also was all the other people that we had looked at in this. Here's an interesting fact here too. This is called the Torchpin Precipitory. This is in Upper Scotland. They have in their website, and you can go to it here if you'd like. They say that that the historical records list the Knights Templar at Torchpin, and one of them was William St. Clair. He was the Master of Arms. So it's possible that this, I can't get to that piece of documentation. I guess you'd have to go there to get it. But this is a link, the St. Clairs, to the Knights Templar. So I'm going to go to Google Earth now, and we'll look at this journey. So here's Petra, right here. And notice that here's the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Notice that it's almost exactly a straight line to Accra. And then they would go to Cyprus, Sicily, and I threw in Rennes Chateau. I know it's sort of a mystic thing, but this area of Toulouse during the time basically of the fall of Accra, which was 1191, was basically taken control of. The control of this would be through Eleanor of Aquitaine, and also the Louisnans. Marguerite Louisnan was also the wife of the ruler of Toulouse area. This area right here would have been a great access up into the castle of Talmont. And then if what was kept at the castle of Talmont, did it go directly up to the Roslin area in Scotland, or did it take a turn to the Royston cave? Was it actually kept at Royston cave? Perhaps maybe 1347 was a date that they took it there, and then 1359 they took it out and brought it into Scotland. Here's where Ralph de Sudeley, here's where his house is, basically where he resided. Here's the Aubrey Hall. This is where there's a preceptory there that has the records of relics that were supposedly from Jerusalem and Ralph de Sudeley. Durham Castle was definitely in control with the Normans at that time. And here's Roslyn right here. Here's that preceptory that has the record of William Sinclair. And another place that I think is interesting is Kilwinning Abbey. This is a very, it's actually a Masonic lodge that is old Masonic lodge is in Kilwinning. So this may also be in play. And then the journey over to Oak Island would be through Iceland, Greenland, there, and then we would end up over here. So in order to do all this, and I know it sounds unbelievable, and it really sort of is unbelievable, if this did occur, you can see the kind of expense, manpower, and basically the clout, not only the nobility and the protection of how you're going to protect this as you're transporting it, and how you would transport it, and once you got to Oak Island, all that construction there, you definitely would have to be somebody of high nobility and high wealth and power to do this. Here's Corfu. This is where King Richard was stranded. So I don't believe King Richard took it home. I don't believe that Ralph de Sudeley took it home. I believe that it is possible that if it was transported and it was left in Cyprus. And Cyprus was basically a stronghold of the Knights Templar until about the 1300s. It started to decay. A lot of fighting between them and the Hospitallers. And then possibly it was moved up into the French region, the southern French region, and possibly it was kept at the Castle Talmont for a period of time, and then possibly moved over to Royston Cave and up into this and came over to Oak Island. So that's what we have. I hope you found this interesting. I'm not that good at history, but I gave it a shot. So like and subscribe, and I'll talk to you later.